That is why the law framed by Parliament are in accordance with the pulse of the people. That was his basic thesis. And once the laws are according to the pulse of the people, they have natural obedience, and there is hardly any need of any enforcement agencies. But by the passage of time, this thesis has become lesser relevant for various reasons. I will not like to go into those reasons today, but in various judgments which I have delivered, I have mentioned this aspect. But the question is, in a parliamentary democracy like India, which is based on British model, the concept of judicial review of legislation is entirely different than what Dicey might have thought. Formulation of Dicey is conceiving Parliament as having absolute power to frame law, that in the scheme of the Constitution, written Constitution, where we have power under Article 13 of judicial review of legislation. In England, we have judicial review of administrative action. If you study Lord Denning in various books and his various lectures advocated that in England also there should be the concept of ultra vires and judicial review of legislation. Somebody asked, what would be the basis for the judges to declare a law as ultra vires? Then his answer used to be that we have plethora of fundamental laws laid down under the common law. If any legislation framed by Parliament contravenes those common law principles, we can declare such a law as ultra vires. But nobody accepted that thesis, and Lord Denning, conversing for that thesis, remain in theory only. So friends, in the written constitution like the one we have, the checks and balances are in place. So there is no room for the belief that a popular government may indulge in any framing of any law which is not consistent with the provisions of the Constitution. It has to conform to the basic structure. The question which we are examining today in Sabrimala case is necessarily pertains to the freedom of religion, freedom of conscience under Article 25, and the right to propagate one's faith and religion, and also to establish institution under Article 26. Religion as such is not defined by the Constitution itself. However, various judgments of the Supreme Court from 1954 have defined religion to mean that it is a matter of faith with the individuals or communities. A religion may only lay down a code of ethical rules for its followers to accept. It might prescribe rituals and observances, ceremonies and modes of worship which are regarded as integral part of religion. Religion is essentially, therefore, is a matter of personal faith. The judgment of the Supreme Court in Jehovah's Witness case, popularly known as where singing of national anthem was not considered compulsory for a particular sect, is very well known. So the personal faith, can that be protected? Is the guarantee under Article 25 of the Constitution would be extended? Lord Rayappa, the deity which is in question in Sabrimala case, did not like the visit of women of reproductive age. The faith of the deity, can that be interfered with? If a deity says that no person with non-vegetarian item should visit the deity, can anybody say that no, I must visit with every non-vegetarian item to the deity? Is it not breach of faith of the deity? Would it not be protected by the Constitution or by applying the principles of equality? It would be extended to even those who are not liked by the deity, who have no faith in that type of faith, in that type of the commitment, the rituals. If we have a deity which uses the color red, can somebody compel that no, color red should not be uniformly used? It should be different color every month, every week. All those questions stare in the face, and probably for that reason, the minority judgment in Sabrimala case has now blown up to review, and 9 judges bench, which have framed 7 questions, is considering those things once again. Therefore, I will not like to, go into the question how far the Sabrimala judgment, majority judgment is correct or incorrect, because Professor Kumar very ably has analyzed every aspect of that judgment, and some of you must have been present in August 2019 when Honorable Mr. Justice Ashok Bhan presided over the colloquium in the Punjab University, where Professor Kumar presented his thesis, which is now published by the Publication Bureau, Punjab University, Chandigarh, and that book is with me. A copy was presented to me by Professor Kumar. So friends, with these opening remarks, I would close my address by urging the young student to come forward and write their own opinion after hearing this lecture and send it to Professor Kumar or Mr. Amar Vivek or to me, so that we may also know how the young mind of the present generation think about Article 25 and 26, which will add to our further orientation, further formulations. With these words, I close my address and express my gratitude to the organizer for providing me this opportunity to share my views with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. Your views have been so lucid, meaningful, and I now request Professor Virender Kumar to take over from here. Professor Virender Kumar.
I am extremely beholden to Sri Vivek, Amar Vivek, Senior Advocate, Punjab and Haryana High Court, to introducing me to this new world, the new world of webinar, and also arranging today's meet and desiring me to deliberate on the subject of my own choice. I am also obliged to him for requesting Mr. Justice M.M. Kumar, former Chief Justice of Jammu and Kashmir High Court, and later the President of the National Company Law Tribunal, for giving us the privilege of presiding over today's deliberation, to which he has very kindly agreed. And I am personally grateful to you, Justice Kumar, for your very kind gesture. I also feel overwhelmed for the overwhelming presence of the participants, and including particularly I will mention the presence of Justice Kannan from Chennai, who has very kindly agreed to join us on this occasion. Today, I shall be deliberating on the subject which is there before you, the socio-religious reform through judicial intervention, its limit and limitation under the Constitution, revisiting the critique of 5-judge Constitution bench in Sabriwala Temple case. Two broad components representing two parts of my presentation today. First component is the critique of Sabriwala Temple case, which to my mind constitutes the major basic premise for my second part. And second part is the revisiting the major basic premise in the context of later judicial development. Now, speaking logically, I cannot do the justification of revisiting until or unless I expound fully the basic premise itself, namely the critique of Sabriwala Temple case. The full exposition of my critique on Sabriwala Temple, if I venture to do so, it would take me more than an hour and a quarter at least. But owing to the extreme paucity of time, I simply do not have the luxury of that kind at my disposal. In this predicament, what I intend to do is to give you a broad perspective of my critique without going into the full-length analysis that I have hitherto undertaken. And so therefore, the synoptic view of 5-judge bench in Sabriwala Temple case, I present it in the form of this critique. It was presented, this critique of Sabriwala Temple case, it was presented as the 57th Punjab University Colloquium Special Lecture on August 27, 2019, under the title Socio-Religious Reform through Judicial Intervention, Its Limit and Limitation under the Constitution, a critique of the 5-judge Constitution bench of Sabriwala Temple case. It has been published as such in the form of a monograph by the Punjab University. Of course, with a foreword by Justice Ashok Bhan, former Judge, Supreme Court of India. I'm just presenting the poster which was released at the time of the 57th colloquium lecture. And this is the first title page of the monograph, which Justice Kumar has just shown to you. I have developed the critique of Sabriwala Temple case in two ways. First, raising three prefatory questions for crystallizing the issue to be resolved, and then raising three critical questions for the resolution of that issue itself. My three prefatory questions are: what is the Sabriwala temple? What is its distinctive character? And why has the Supreme Court judgment on Sabriwala temple case caused a sort of social upheaval across India? Let me give you a pictorial view of the Sabriwala temple. It is an old Hindu temple of 12th century dedicated to Lord Ayappa. Since this temple is situated at Sabriwala in one of the districts of the state of Kerala, it is popularly came to be known as the Sabriwala temple. Now, this is the picture of the Sabriwala temple with the caption, "The annual pilgrimage season," which begins from the beginning of November and ends with the end of January. Now, this is important to understand some of the events that has took place in this case. Now, this is one of the most visited sites at the world level. It is estimated that every year during the pilgrimage season, it is visited by visitors, their number ranging from 15 million to 50 millions per annum. Now, what is the distinctive character of the Sabriwala temple? I think this is the important fact which we have to bear in mind. The deity of Lord Ayappa installed in this temple bears the eternal celibate character, Nashtik Brahmachari. And customarily, owing to deep reverence for the celibate nature of this deity, women devotees of menstruating age, 10 to 50 years, are prohibited to enter this temple. It is this customary practice which is codified in the form of Rule 3B by the state of Kerala more than 50 years back by enacting the appropriate laws, namely the Kerala Hindu Places of Public Worship Authorization of Entry Rules of 1965, along with the corresponding rules under the Act of 1965, along with the corresponding rules of 1965. Now, this Rule 3B came to be questioned in a public interest litigation before the Constitution bench of 5 judges led by the Chief Justice. The critical contentious constitutional issue to be resolved in this case was whether this Rule 3B of the rules of 1965, barring women of menstruating age from entering the Sabriwala temple, whether it is constitutionally consistent. The 5-judge bench of the Supreme Court, by a majority of 4:1, held that this Rule 3B, excluding the menstruating women from Sabriwala temple, is unconstitutional. It is unconstitutional as it violates the fundamental rights contained in Article 14, 15, 25, and 26 of the Constitution. Since the whole discussion revolves around these 4 articles, Article 14, 15, 25, and 26, they could be broadly classified into 2 categories. One category consisting of Article 14 and 15, to which we may call the right to equality and non-discrimination, and Article 25 and 26 together, they give us what is known as the freedom of religion. Now, this 5-judge bench, 4 judges said that this barring the menstruating women from entering the temple is unconstitutional. Only the 1 judge, who happened to be the female judge on the bench, women member of the bench, she said that such a customary is perfectly constitutional as it does not violate either of the fundamental rights contained in the Constitution. Now, this was an unprecedented decision. I just quote a statement from the majority court decision. I quote, that 68 years after the advent of the Constitution, we have held that in providing equality in matters of faith and worship, the Constitution does not allow the exclusion of women. It was an unprecedented decision. Unprecedented in the sense that for good 68 years, this customary practice was perfectly constitutional. There was no problem. But after 68 years, after the judgment, majority judgment in Sabriwala Temple case on September 28, 2018, this customary practice has become unconstitutional. Now, this unprecedented decision provoked an unprecedented response, reactive responses. Two opposite responses. But I may call it a positive response, and another is a furiously negative response. What is this positive response? Positive passive response is that of person to whom I may call it modernist. Modernists are the person who are steeped into the tradition of rationality, Western jurisprudential thought, who believe that in the power of the state to change the social religious norms through the force of law. Law is a powerful instrument of social change. This opinion is evident in the writings of the opinion makers, such as editors, who wholeheartedly hailed the judgment of the majority court and vehemently resisted its reversal by the state. Let me cite an editorial published in Hindustan Times. Says, don't outlaw social reforms. Going against progressive judgment is a step in the wrong direction. Against this passive positive opinion, there is a furiously negative reactive response of a person to whom I call it traditionalist. And I may just bear in mind the broad distinction between traditionalist and modernist. Traditionalists are the ones who believe in faith, religious faith, tradition, and they say that the law is not there to change society. The law is merely a mirror reflection of society, that it must commensurate to the sentiments of the society itself. Now, this kind of a reactive opinion is evident in the precipitated protests by the various Hindu organizations led by both men and women soon after the pronouncement of the Supreme Court judgment. Let me show you the activists of various Hindu outfits protested silently in front of the Supreme Court in New Delhi, right on September 28, 2018, saying that Save Sabriwala, stop interference in the affairs of Hindu temples. Now, this was the procession led by the Hindu women themselves. This silent protest took a volatile turn in the month of December. The occasion was, in the month of December, you kindly recall, is the pilgrimage season, when the thousands and thousands of judicial devotees are visiting the Sabriwala temple. What happened was that the 11 women activists, as if holding in their hands the court decree, allowing them to visit the Sabriwala temple as the fundamental rights, on the basis of the fundamental right to equality, escorted by the police bandobast, state police bandobast, they marched toward the Sabriwala temple. Since it was a pilgrimage season, the overwhelming number of devotees was enough just to shoo them away from that site. The next month, in the month of January, which was the peak season of the pilgrimage peak season, what happened was the volatile protest turned violent. The occasion was that two women activists, in disguise, somehow or other, they managed to reach the temple. Once they reached the temple, then they revealed their identity and said to the gathering there that here we are, the young women, we are here in the exercise of our fundamental right to equality. So we have got the equal right. Now this all of a sudden created a violent protest. Arrests were made of the devotees, and very soon it spread like a wildfire from the south to the north across the borders of the states. Scores of review petitions were filed in the Supreme Court, urging the Supreme Court to recall and reverse the decision of the majority court. At that point of time, Supreme Court agreed for the immediate consideration of the review petition as a diffusing measure in an unprecedented manner. The Chief Justice said that we do recognize your considerations. We would consider them as soon as possible. We would consider your review petitions in the open court. We would allow you to be represented by the lawyers. We would allow you to include any other point, factors, facts which you think is material for the reconsideration of your review petitions. Now, this was an unprecedented mode of reviewing in the sense that ordinarily the review petitions are always considered in the closed chamber of the judges, without the intervention of lawyers, merely on the basis of records which are already there before them, and without allowing them to put in any other extra factors which was not being argued before the court initially. No, so this was an unprecedented mode of reviewing. But then he said that I can't consider right in the month of January because one of the members of the original bench, Justice Indu Malhotra, she was on long leave. She was on medical leave for 1 month, and she would return only at the end of January. So therefore, it would be possible for us, for the Supreme Court, to consider the review petition only in the beginning of the month of January. Lo and behold, I think they were pacified, the agitation subsided, the month of February came, Supreme Court, as committed earlier, they took up the review petition for their considerations. There were as many as 65 review petitions, including review pleas, seeking the review or the verdict of the Constitutional Bench. And the proceeding began and the arguments were concluded on 6th of February, 2019. After the conclusion of this, the arguments, the judgment was kept reserved. Now, it is in this backdrop, I thought that I must undertake a critiquing of this judgment, but then I was waiting slightly for the authoritative outcome of the review petitions judgment. On my discreet inquiry, I found that there is no possibility of pronouncing the reserved judgment in any near future. In that predicament, well, I proceeded with my critique, posing a first question to myself: why critiquing of the Sabrimala temple is desiderated? Why the critiquing is necessary? Now, this is a question which I posed to myself because I want to take the critique, so I must answer first why this critique is. I found two principal reasons for undertaking the critiquing exercise. The first reason was that since this was an unprecedented decision of the Supreme Court, impinges upon the fundamental right to freedom of conscience for the first time, unprecedented, a value which is intensely private and personal in human life existence, it has created a sort of social upheaval which could never ever be the result of pursuing of freedom of conscience. So this has prompted me to relook at the judgment critically. Then there was a second principal reason of critiquing. It is a matter of our serious academic concern to explore how come the five-judge bench of the Supreme Court is divided in interpreting the same provision of the constitutional fundamental right to freedom of religion, and that too in relation to the same fact matrix presented before the court. Critiquing is imperative, I believe, to resolve the duality of interpretation, because the duality is destructive of the constitutional system of governance. So these were the two principal reasons which prompted me to undertake the critiquing of the Sabriwala temple case. Now, what was the modus operandi of my critiquing? I said, we wish to critically examine the decision of the Supreme Court construing the fundamental right to freedom of religion as enunciated in Article 25 and 26, along with Article 14 and 15 of the Constitution, de novo, afresh, without being arrested by any other consideration, not even by precedents. And this we wanted to do on the first principle of constitutionalism. What is constitutionalism? Constitutionalism is a system of governance in which sovereignty lies not in the parliament, not in the executive government of the day, not even in the executive government and the parliament together, and not even in the Supreme Court itself. Supreme Court is supreme, but Supreme Court is not sovereign. If it is not sovereign, sovereignty lies in the Constitution. So therefore, it is perhaps both the right as well as an obligation, as well as a fundamental duty of the law teachers to undertake the task of critiquing. And critiquing is not to be misunderstood as a criticism. Critiquing is a criticism with a reason. So we have to provide a reason on any count on which we deviate from the judgment of the Supreme Court. In order to do this, I have raised three critical questions. And these three critical questions will be central to our critiquing of the Sabriwala temple case. These three questions are, first, what is the juxtaposition, that is relative position, of the fundamental right of freedom to conscience as spelled out in Article 25 in the complex of fundamental rights as enunciated in Part 3 of the Constitution? What can be the relative position, juxtaposition, relative position? As I mentioned earlier, the whole critique revolves around four fundamental rights, Article 14, 15, 25, and 26. 25 and 26 represent the freedom of religion, and all other rights, including the rights enunciated in Article 14 and 15, that is right to equality and non-discrimination, on the other. So juxtaposition means that how do you place the freedom of religion vis-a-vis the right to equality and non-discrimination? This was the first question which I explored fully in my critical analysis. The second question of our critique is, what is the intrinsic value of the fundamental right to freedom to manage religious affairs under Article 26 of the Constitution? What is the intrinsic value of the fundamental right to freedom to manage religious affairs? This is Article 26. Article 26 opens, subject to public order, morality, health, every religious denomination shall have the right to manage its own religious affairs. So freedom to manage religious affairs is the very title, is the very crux of Article 26. Now I have explored this question fully in my analysis, which I presented, and happily, since it is published also, so therefore you can have an access to that broad analysis of mine. And there is the third critical question. Third critical question, what is the pivotal provision under the Constitution to protect the freedom of religion in the wake of social religious reform by the state. Now, in fact, this question can be answered with the joint consideration of Article 25 and 26 together. I have presented a broad analysis of these three questions. Now, because of the paucity of time, I would not be able to undertake the critique of these very three questions, which are critically important to reach any conclusion. Now, in the light of the critical analysis, I have presented my conclusion. My conclusion of critique was in the form of 5 summation statements, critiquing 5 foundational bases of the Supreme Court decision in the Sabharwala Temple case. The first summation statement is re-juxtaposition. I would like you to read these 5 conclusions carefully with me, because I'm presenting before you without presenting the analysis, though this conclusion is based on the analysis which I have presented earlier. The majority court interpretation of the subjective clause of Article 25 on grounds of overriding right to equality and non-discrimination tends to obliterate the independent identity and autonomy of the right to freedom of religion, freedom of conscience, which is not warranted by the scheme of fundamental rights in Part 3 of the Constitution. Juxtaposition. You see, Article 25, Clause 1 says, subject to public order, morality, health, and other provisions of this part, all persons, not citizens, all persons are equally entitled to the freedom of conscience and the freedom to profess, practice, and propagate religion. Now, they have interpreted the subjective clause by saying that right to freedom of religion as if it has been overridden by the right to equality and non-discrimination. Now, this interpretation of overriding, in my view, tends to obliterate the independent identity and autonomy of the right of freedom of conscience, which is not warranted by the scheme of fundamental rights in Part 3. In our view, the subjective clause of Article 25, Clause 1 requires rereading consistently with the independence and autonomy of the right to freedom of religion as fundamental right in Part 3, admit no hierarchical basis amongst themselves. In the fundamental rights, there is no hierarchical basis. So the only hierarchical principle which we are trying to derive is from the subjective clause. Now, what do we mean by subjective clause? Now, the majority judgments has interpreted the subjective clause mean that freedom of religion is subservient to the right to equality and non-discrimination under Article 25, which I don't agree. For that reason, I would agree with the conclusion of the minority court judgment, you see, or judgment of Indu Malhotra. Now, my second submission is regarding the summation re-intrinsic value. This is on Article 26. Majority court interpretation of the fundamental right to freedom to manage religious affairs under Article 26. Now, this is the lacuna I discovered. It tends to destroy intrinsic value by unduly denying the devotees of Sabharwala Temple of their freedom to consider themselves as a religious denomination, and thereby denying them the right to determine their own do's and don'ts as an expression of one's belief, faith, and worship. The denial of denominational nature is simply because the Sabharwala Temple is visited by persons of different religious persuasions without ceasing their own faith or belief, which is a total negation of the philosophy of secularism. Because this is the kind of a basic reason which emerges from the majority court judgment, that the devotees of Sabharwala Temple, they are not entitled to call themselves a religious denomination. Religious denomination means a religious group, which as such is not defined in the Constitution, but it is defined in various judicial decisions of the Supreme Court. I will come back to this. There is a third submission, the constitutional protection, Article 26. The majority court, in the wake of social religious reform, has unwittingly removed the constitutional protection provided to freedom to manage religious affairs under Article 26 by reading the express absence of the control mechanism as its implied presence. Now, this would require, because I have not presented the analysis, so I think I can just give you the background. Article 25, clause 1, it opens, kindly bear in mind, subject to public order, morality, health, and other provisions of this part, all persons are equally entitled to freedom of conscience. Against this, Article 26 opens, subject to public order, morality, and health, every religious denomination shall have the right. Now, here in this clause, Article 26, there is no word or other parts of the Constitution, other part of this, other provisions of this part, other provision of Part 3 of the Constitution. But in their judgment, they have said that even this right of religious denomination is subject to the other provisions of this part. So my basic objection is that the majority judgment in their reading of Article 26, they have read the absence as its implied presence. Now this has caused the imbalance, and the balance which was intended by the constitution makers, that balance has been deflected. Then the fourth submission. My fourth submission is in redo questioning. Kindly read this. I have formulated and framed with care. In a democratic secular polity, which is essentially multiplex and not monolithic, we need to learn to respect and accept the religious persuasions of diverse people without unduly questioning the mode of their faith and worship, except to the limited extent on the constitutionally specified grounds. What are those grounds? Public order, morality, and health, wherein morality needs to be construed from the viewpoint of the devotees of the religious denomination concerned, and as has been done rightly in our view by the state of Kerala while framing Rule 3B of the Kerala Rule of 1965. And my fifth submission is regarding the role, mode, and manner of socio-religious reform. Now, this is the concluding para of my initial critique. So kindly read with me just a longish, slightly longish paragraph. Our salvation in a democratic secular polity lies not in forcing unity in uniformity from without, but in promoting unity in diversity from within. Diversity is neither discriminatory, nor destructive, nor even divisive. It is the essence of innate unity that makes India truly incredible, as it leaves the people free to evolve and unfold themselves and their own potentials in response to the call of space and time, Desh and Kal. In our exposition of Article 25 and 26, read with Articles 14 and 15, freedom of religion, I have underlined the word of, freedom of religion within the complex of Constitution should not be mistaken for freedom from religion, you see. And this is how I have ended my critique of the Sabriwala 5-judge bench of the Sabriwala temple case. Now, it is this critique which constitutes the basic premise for my second part of the presentation. And the second part of my presentation is that what has prompted us to revisit the critique of Sabriwala temple case at this juncture. I wanted to take the critique later after the 9-judge bench judgment of the Supreme Court, but that judgment is yet to be delivered. So therefore, I would call this revisit of mine as a midstream visit after its presentation on August 27, 2019. So this is the second part of mine, and this is the major part of the presentation today. Now the prompting factor for revisiting, what was this? This is the one which was the startling factor. It is the pronouncement of the review judgment on November 14, 2019. The revised judgment was pronounced on November 14, 2019, which was reserved on February 6, 2019. See how much time has elapsed? It has taken full 9 months to deliver this review judgment. And this review judgment was delivered by the 5-judge constitution. What did they do? Referring the matter to 7-judge constitution bench on 7 issues without deciding the review petition. Now this is completely, it was an unexpected judgment. Unexpected, unprecedented judicial decision. Why do I say unexpected? I recall when the judgment of the review petition was being reserved on 6 February 2019. There's something startling happened at that time. Startling thing was that one of the major opponents to the judgment of the Supreme Court was no other but the board which was responsible for managing the religious affair at the Sabrimala temple. Now it is that board who took a U-turn completely. They said, no. In deference to the wishes of the Supreme Court judgment, majority judgment, we resile from the earlier stand, you see. So, in fact, this I say so because after the judgment was reserved, in one of the interaction with the press, the pressman asked Justice Indu Malhotra, what have you to say about the review petition? She simply said, what can I say? You know, what can I say? Now, it was a startling. So therefore, I would say it was completely an unexpected, unprecedented judicial decision that instantly transforms, as if by a quirk of judicial fiat. What was the judicial fiat? The initial minority judgment of 1:4, initially minority judgment of 1:4, it turned into the majority judgment of 3:2. Minority judgment of 1:4 is turned into the majority judgment of 3:2. In our view, such a pronouncement has come as a most pleasant surprise, as I hear in the 7-issue reference the resonance of my own critique that I presented on August 27, 2019. Now, let me see that how do I show you, how do I share that resonance of mine. Now, first let us see what are the 7-issue reference. I reproduced here the 7-issue reference for 7-judge constitutional bench. It is fairly closely written. I don't want you to strain your eyes while doing a close reading. I would do the reading for you in an easier way, I would say. And this easier way, I want to adopt to make you comprehend the 7-issue reference. I pose a question. I have posed the question, where does lie the centrality of the 7 crystallized issue that require deeper consideration by the 7-judge bench of the Supreme Court? Centrality. Where does lie the center of gravity of the 7-issue reference, you see? Now, this is how I am making it easier for you to read the 7-issue reference. How to decipher this centrality? How to decipher the centrality of the 7 issues? Now, this is the technique I have followed. A bare perusal of the serialized 7 issues would reveal that the issues listed from serial number 2 to 7 are merely an exposition of the various facets of the issue at serial number 1, which indeed is the basic fundamental question of constitutional interpretation, namely, how to construe the interplay between the fundamental right to equality and non-discrimination on the one hand, and the fundamental right to freedom of religion on the other in our constitutional scheme of things. Now, this central issue has hitherto remained unanswered, but then it has remained unanswered, but soon it has gathered a further momentum, the Central 7 issue. How did it gather a momentum? How did it gather a momentum? I found the centrality of 7 issue reference to 7 judge constitution bench gained momentum structurally as well as substantively. I have coined this new expression in order to express the idea of the development which has ensued. On January 6, 2020, the Supreme Court constituted a bench of 9 judges instead of 7, as was envisaged earlier, for hearing the 7 issue reference, which shall commence hearing from January 13, 2020. This I called a structural ascendancy from 7 to 9. Earlier, this issue was to be considered by 7 judges, but now they said this issue is so important that it must be considered by 9 judges, you see. So this is what I call structural ascendancy. Second is, on January 13, 2020, sorry for interruption, that on January 13, 2020, at the commencement of the hearing of the 9-judge bench of the Supreme Court, they clarified that the 9-judge bench would confine itself in answering the larger issue and will not decide the review petition itself. Now, to my mind, this was a substantive augmentation in the sense that their sole concern is to address themselves to the centrality of the 7 issue reference and without doing anything else. Now, first, before I proceed further, I may just look at the genesis of the relative progression of this core of the constitutional issue. I find, now what is the genesis of the relative progression of the core constitutional issue? I trace the genesis of relative progression of the core constitutional issue which is hitherto remained unanswered authoritatively. I trace to 3 phases of constitutional reconstruction, which I described as, first, the opportunity for reconstruction of the Constitution arose but missed, opportunity for judicial reconstruction of Constitution arose but lost, and third, opportunity for reconstruction arose and it was captured. Let me make a brief mention of this. First is the centrality, the opportunity missed. Now, this is in relation to the opportunity that came before the 7-judge bench of the Supreme Court in Abhiram Singh case, while deciding the issue in an election case, whether the appeal made by the election candidate on ground of religion to the electorates is ipso facto destructive of the secular character of a democratic polity. Now, this was an election case, and I have been critically examining the judgment of the Supreme Court in election matters since the year 1984, and my survey is published every year in the Annual Survey of Indian Law since then. Now, when this judgment came, I did a critique on this judgment. I did a critique on the judgment by the title, Varying Approaches to Religion Under the Electoral Law, a Functional Comparative Perspective of the Deeply Divided Opinion of 7-judge bench in the Abhiram case. This was published in an international journal, the Indian Yearbook of Comparative Law. Now, this critique of mine shows that the 7-judge constitution bench has missed the opportunity of constitutional reconstruct as they held by a close majority of 4:3 that the larger issue of constitutional interpretation did not arise before them for consideration. And so therefore, I read again, once again, that this 7-judge bench missed this opportunity for constitutional reconstruct as they held by a close majority of 4:3 that the larger issue of constitutional interpretation did not arise for consideration before them. What does it mean? 3 judges said that in order to decide this issue of electoral dispute, you need to devote your attention to resolving the fundamental question of constitutional import. And so therefore, that question must be considered now. But this opinion was overruled by 4 judges by simply saying, well, this decision, this question has not arisen before them directly. It was merely a question of an electoral dispute. So therefore, they would not go into the constitutional issue. So to my mind, this is a question, this is an opportunity which was missed. Then came the opportunity which was lost. The singular opportunity for constitutional reconstruct directly arose in the Sabriwala temple case, but lost, as we have argued in our critique that the majority court judgment in their reformative zeal have failed to recognize and realize the essence of that inter-se relationship between the fundamental right to equality and non-discrimination on the one hand, and fundamental right to freedom of religion as envisaged by the founding fathers of the Constitution on the other. Then there is a third. This is what I described as opportunity regained, opportunity resurrected. This opportunity for constitutional reconstruct in Sabriwala is regained by the same 5-judge bench, Constitution bench of the Supreme Court, while delivering the reserved judgment on the review petition on November 14, 2019, and making the 7-issue reference to 7-judge Constitution bench, which in turn passed on the reference to the 9-judge bench. Now, this is an important landmark for my revisiting. It is in this regard, it is this regained opportunity that constitutes the basis of revisiting our critique with reference to the 7-issue reference. The question is how to do it, you see. I hear the resonance of my critique in the 7-issue reference, but my concern is that how to make you hear that reference which I have heard or which I am hearing. Now for this, in order to make you hear that resonance which I am hearing of my critique in the 7-issue reference, I am adopting the technique, what I call the technique of jurisprudential comparative perspective. Now, what is this jurisprudential comparative perspective technique? This is the technique of relatedness. That what is the relatedness between the 7-issue reference and our critique on Sabriwala case on 2018 in terms of points of convergence and divergence, in points of similarities and in point of dissimilarities. That what is the difference between the two? 7-issue reference on the one hand and my critique on the other. Let us see on point of convergence. I find on the point of convergence in terms of the commonality of the problem which is sought to be resolved. Both the centrality of the 7-issue reference and our critique revolve around the resolution of one and the same basic fundamental question of constitutional interpretation, namely, how to construe the interplay between the fundamental right to equality and non-discrimination under Article 14 and 15 of the Constitution on the one hand, and fundamental right to freedom of religion under Article 25 and 26 on the other. So there is absolutely convergence, both 7-point reference, centrality of the 7-point reference, and our critique, they converge on a single point. Then I come to the point of divergence, point of deviations. And I find this point of divergence or deviations in terms of the stimulus to seek solution to the common problem. What is in terms of the stimulus? That what is that stimulus which has prompted the 9-judge bench, which has prompted the 5-judge bench to refer the matter to the 7-judge bench? What was the stimulus, you see? I have examined this proposition, and I would say the stimulus for 7-issue reference, the stimulus has come from outside. Why do I say outside? According to my reading, this stimulus lies in seeking to resolve the problem because the judgment in Sabriwala Temple case 2018, not to be read at 2019, has a bearing upon religious customary practices. I'm quoting the 5-judge bench observation while making a reference to 7-judge bench. They said the judgment in Sabriwala Temple case has a bearing upon religious customary practices other than those of Hindus, namely Muslims, Parsis, Dabur, and the cases of such communities are already pending before the Supreme Court, and the prospect of referring those cases to court to a larger bench cannot be ruled out. Now, this is, I would say, a stimulus from outside, that they don't want to decide the review petition. They said this review petition is to be decided by a 7-judge bench. Why? Because there are certain other cases which are pending elsewhere in other courts, before the other constitution benches, and they belong to the different religion, because presently in Sabriwala case, they were concerned only with the Hindu temples on factual metrics. But in order to decide this issue relating to Hindus, they have to make a reference to the outside. Stimulus came from outside. Now, against this outside stimulus, let us look at the stimulus for our critique. The stimulus for our critique has arisen from within. Why do I say it is arisen from within? Now, this I say so because it lies in the basic assumption. What is the basic assumption? It lies in the basic assumption that the award objective of the Constitution bench is not just merely to decide the list dispute or a controversy. Its award objective is not decide the dispute between the opposing parties before the bench. Its onerous responsibility lies in settling the law that was answered as far as possible, not only the cases that are pending before it, but also the ones that are likely to come in future. We say so for the constitutional document, namely the Constitution of India, which is to be interpreted by the constitution benches, is a living, organic document of a futuristic import guiding the destiny of the nation. Now, when I'm making this basic assumption, how strong I am in making this presumption would take you to the work which I have done earlier for expounding the exposition of the basic assumption. I am presenting before you the article which I done in 2016. This is a review article, a review on a book, and the title of the book was Statement of Indian Law, Supreme Court of India through its Constitution Bench Decision since 1950. Now, this is a 2-volume published by an international journal, international publisher, Deuter and Thompson's. This book was released by the Chief Justice of India on April 5, 2015, by presenting a copy, first copy of this publication to the President of India in the Rashtrapati Bhavan. I do recall the presence of Honorable Justice M.M. Kumar, the presence on that occasion. Now, it is Indian Law Institute of New Delhi. They gave me the privilege of doing the critique of this momentous work, you see. When I opened this work, I found there were almost a dozen and a half pre-publication reviews by the distinguished judges, former Chief Justices of the Supreme Court, High Court, and legal luminaries. I felt aghast that what kind of a review I'm going to do. So I decided that let me take the privilege of doing a review article instead of a review of a page and a half. I would do the review article. So this led me to examine the contribution of the constitutional benches of the Supreme Court. So in the light of that, my study, I have said that we have vehemently argued that the core constitutional objective of constitutional benches under Article 145 of the Constitution is to resolve the substantial question of law as to the interpretation of the Constitution. This is the basic purpose. And in the exercise of this while doing, which would subsume the controversy before the Constitution bench. Now, this is the common law tradition. The law is evolved through interpretation. This law is evolved in the light of the concrete situation presented before them. Though the concrete situation is there, but the law which is projected on the basis of that concrete situation, that is a futuristic import. That law, that principle which is laid down is not only that would govern that particular case, because when the 9-judge bench has said, just only a minor comment, that they would decide only the central issue raised in the 7-point present without deciding the review petition. I may ask, do you really think so that they would not decide in the review petition itself? Review petition would dissolved, understood in the light of the principle which they are laid down. So this is the exposition of my assumption which I made behind the constituting the constitutional benches of the Supreme Court. Having done this, I would go towards my conclusion. And this conclusion, I want to submit before you by raising a question itself. My question is, what is the critical functional value of revisiting our critique as a continuing academic exercise in the context of 7-issue reference pending before the 9-judge bench of the Supreme Court? What is the critical functional value of revisiting our critique as a continuing academic exercise in the context of the 7-issue reference pending before the 9-judge bench of the Supreme Court? Now, it is this question which leads me to make my final submission. And kindly read this para with me. Have you the patience for another minute or so? The functional value of our critique vis-a-vis 7-issue reference. Our critique on Sabriwala Temple case 2018 carries a distinctive critical functional value inasmuch as in it we have not only anticipated the centrality of the 7-issue reference by specifically raising 3 critical questions for exploring the interplay between the constitutionality, between the constitutional right of freedom of religion under Article 25 and 26 and the right to equality and non-discrimination under Article 14 and 15. We have anticipated what the 5-judge bench has referred in their 7 issues reference. After having anticipated this centrality of the question, I proceed further. We have not only anticipated, but we have also responded them in full measure. And this is the critique which is lying embedded now in the published monograph. How have I expounded in full? Since these very questions are yet to be answered principally, authoritatively, by the 9-judge bench in response to the 7-issue reference, their response is keenly awaited, as that would give us another opportunity of revisiting our critique and see for ourselves in retrospect once again how far we are justified in comprehending the constitutional jurisprudence and say with a certain degree of certitude that in the realm of freedom of religion, read with the right to the freedom of right to equality, freedom of religion, I am underlining, freedom of religion should not be mistaken for freedom from religion. This is where I have concluded in my critique of 2018, and I am revisiting critique with the same emphasis. With these few words, I thank you once again for bearing with me for my a little longish elaboration.
Sir, thank you very much. It never seemed that we were listening to an 84-year-old professor. We thought the presentation through the use of technology, through the use of slides, it was simply marvelous. We were transported back to the days when we were in your class. Sir, it was, I am left speechless, but since this is a medium which you learned probably just in matter of 48 hours, that shows that a professor is always a professor, and we will always be your students. Thank you very much, sir, for a very lucid presentation. We have with us Justice Kannan, and it will be an honor for us. And already Professor Kumar has made a request to Justice Kannan to come forward and say a few words of enlightenment. I would now invite Justice Kannan with us to kindly come and make a presentation.
No, I'm not making a presentation. I'm not making a presentation, I reiterate. If you have been rendered speechless, how can I have words to say? So it was surely an astounding exposition. And thank you very much, Dr. Virendra Kumar, for this excellent work. I have one or two concerns. They are, if a judgment of what is pronounced, could it have been taken up for review because of what was happening outside, or was it driven only through what is happening in the courts? If public outcry and our behavior on the streets must pilot how the courts must decide, it will be dangerous situations. So that many of the decisions of the Supreme Court are counter-majoritarian. You can't expect all the people to like your judgment, but still you must be able to push through with it. So probably it leaves us with that kind of a lesson here, that this judgment of what was not probably popular when it was first done, they have secured to themselves another opening by pointing out that there are other cases which are pending. We'll put it along that. Probably, as an outsider, I would like to think if in any one of those judgments, it should have been possible for them to say that the judgment which was decided in Sabarimala was probably not correctly decided, and revisited Sabarimala there instead of getting caught in this. That is one some observation for me. Another thing, we need to remind ourselves that courts do not have answers for all types of situations, that we must stay humble to realize that issues of religion and the way it is carried out in any particular temple or mosque or church will have to be regulated through how it is practiced over a period of time. And if a reform must come from within than imposed from outside. This is perhaps a reason why it happened. It all started, probably some of us will remember, of younger lawyers will not know. There was someone who filed a writ petition in High Court at Calcutta saying that the Quran is against Article 14. There are several references against women. There is no equality. Court had ordered notice, and there was virtual mayhem on streets. The Attorney General was sent from Delhi to go to the court to withdraw the notice. The court actually did. They rose to see that the public outcry was such that we won't be able to carry on any conversations with any decency or order. So therefore, if we must raise questions of what is equality in religious practices, that could be very dangerous. Probably in the matters of religion, the society will, as it progresses, will get to know how it is to be done. So it's a very, very sensitive subject, a very sensitive point that required constitutional interpretation ways which only an expert could deal with. You dealt with this topic with such finesse. I'm like what Amar says, I'm speechless. Thank you very much to Professor Virendra Kumar and to everyone there, and to particularly also our former Chief Justice, M.M. Kumar, a great person to have been worked with. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Justice Kannan. I will be failing in my duty to acknowledge two aspects, sir. One, Justice Kumar was ably assisted in the use of this technology, because when I requested Justice Kumar that to chair this session, he agreed only because he has able assistance. Secondly, the way I have said that
It's 13
Professor
hours.
Kumar, he adapted himself to the technology was outstanding. I have with us, you know, it is again honor for us, a doctor, a dentist who later converted to hospital administration and currently a student of law. And by the side of Justice Kumar, we have Dr. Misha Kumar, who is herself pursuing, constitutional studies. I would request her to please come forward. She has been an able support to Justice Kumar. Over to Dr. Misha Kumar. Please unmute yourself. Please unmute yourself. Yes. No. Again, you have muted. Yes. Now it's fine. Now it's fine.
Good morning, everybody. I express my gratitude for giving me this opportunity to express my views before such an esteemed panel. I have been lucky to be able to attend Professor Kumar's lecture in the Punjab University last year after the first decision by the Supreme Court on the issue of Sabrimala Temple. Article 26 used the word denomination, while Article 25 uses the word person. And Article 26, as Sir has explained so beautifully, has deliberately avoided using reference to the expression other provisions of Part 3. So a religious denomination does not make the freedom to manage religious affairs subject to other provisions of Part 3, as does Article 25. Therefore, we may submit that to apply Article 14 and Article 15 to Article 26 may not be warranted, as has been rightly opined by the minority government in the Sabrimala case. As a student of constitutional law, I'm trying to evaluate various provisions of Part 3 by assigning them certain percentages of significance. For instance, can 100% importance be allocated to Article 20 and 21 and say all other articles in Part 3 which guarantee fundamental rights would be rated at 60%, 70%, 80%, etc., and would always be subordinate to Article 20 and 21. It appears that in the Keshwananda Bharti case, while laying down the principles of basic structure of the Constitution, the Apex Court has kept the final answer to this question with itself to be given in every individual case, and the legislative bodies like the Parliament and assemblies have very little guidance available in this regard. This uncertainty prevails, and the laws are framed by the Parliament and the assemblies under advice of various committees. And on account of lack of an elaborate guidance on the basic structure, the advisory committees of the Parliament and assemblies have been advising them to frame laws what they think is constitutionally sustainable. Later on, it may be tested in the Supreme Court as well. But would it not be better if the Supreme Court, in the first instance, defines what the basic structure is more elaborately so? So these are my humble submissions. As a very nascent staged student, I thank you so much for enlightening us, Professor Kumar, and it has been great to read your review and learn more about constitutional law. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Misha. Thank you very much for actually summing up and taking up that responsibility from me. Sir, we quickly have one or two questions. Chaitanya has asked, since right to religion has been guaranteed to all without any discrimination under the Indian Constitution, so is Sabrimala issue a constraint to this right? I can read again, sir, for my benefit. Since right to religion has been guaranteed to all without any discrimination under the Indian Constitution, so is Sabrimala issue a constraint to this right?
Should I answer? Yes, yes. Yeah, I think I can answer this question. In fact, I have dealt with it in my analysis and try to see that how the freedom of religion under Article 25 and 26 is perfectly consistent with Article 14 and 15. Why do I say so? The only thing is that we have to read the subject to clause in Article 25 carefully. Subject to clause, to my mind, in order to reconcile both 24 and 25 on the one hand and 14 and 15 on the other, how to reconcile? Because apparently it appears that there is a kind of a overriding subject to, overriding, you see. Now, but then this overriding creates a problem. And that problem which is created here is that this right to freedom of conscience, which is so eloquently expressed in Article 25, that all persons are equally entitled to freedom of conscience, how it is to be read with umbrella of subject to clause. That was the question before them. Now, in my view, it can be read consistently until you have to bear two perspectives in your mind. That subject to clause is qualified by two considerations. It bears two perspectives. One I may call a positive perspective, another is a restrictive perspective. What is this restrictive perspective? Positive perspective. Positive perspective is that in the right of exercise of right to equality and non-discrimination, you can claim to go and enter the Sabrimala temple. Fine. But then while doing so, you must observe the tenets of their religion. Let me manufacture an example, simpler example, because Sabrimala is not understood that way. I am a traditional Hindu. I wish to go and pay my respect to Guru Granth Sahib in a Gurdwara. Now I am a Hindu. Can't I go in the light of my right to equality and non-discrimination? I can go. But the only thing is that when I go, I must observe their tenets. One of the tenets is I must cover my head, you see. So long I cover my head, there is no difficulty. But then there is a negative perspective also of this. Negative perspective is that in the exercise of a right to equality and non-discrimination, you have no right to deprive others of their right, you see. For example, right, turning to the same example, I said, no, I will go to the Gurdwara in the exercise of my right to equality and non-discrimination, but I will go bareheaded. I will go shoes on. What I'm doing, am I not depriving them of their right of freedom of conscience? So therefore, what is needed is that this clause, subject to clause, has to be read carefully. And that careful reading is that it bears two opposite perspectives, and those two opposite perspectives are not necessarily neutralizing each other. These are the two sides of the same coin. Two sides of the same coin. And when we say these are the two sides of the same coin, they reinforce each other rather than being an antithesis of one against the other, you see. So therefore, it is not to be misconstrued that way. it leaves enough space for the freedom of religion for both of them. Have I answered the question?
I think, sir, the illustration with which you have answered, it was completely satisfying. Not many questions have come, but we have already overshot our time by 9 minutes. We have with us Chief Justice Kumar, and I had the good fortune of learning from him. A large number of young advocates and young professionals, students are amidst us. I would request Justice Kumar to kindly tell us how that we can make a progress in the profession, how we devote ourselves. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Amar Vivek. Well, the profession, I remember when I came back from England after doing my master's, I met Dr. Virender Kumar, and my request to become a part-time lecturer, guest faculty at the law department was not honored at that stage by the then chairman, because I wanted to practice, because profession was very dear to me. Now, as a young advocate, there was primarily the question of becoming accessible to the litigant public, knowing them, becoming accessible, and that too without using any unethical means. The one practice which I adopted was that if I have visit of, say, 5 clients, I would not be accepting the briefs of all the 5. I would accept the brief of only 2 or 3. I remember one example. I refused a brief of an engineer who had undergone departmental inquiry. And after examining the paper, I found that there was no lapse of rules committed by the inquiry officer. And therefore, I said, you have nothing in your case. I will not be able to get you anything. Then, because he was very affluent, he went to Shri Jagannath Kaushal, a very eminent counsel. Kaushal Sahab asked him, who has earlier advised you? He named me. Then a few days later in the bar room, Shri Kaushal met me and told me, Mr. Kumar, by refusing a brief, you have done well. I have done the same thing. Because if you refuse a brief and honestly opine, then you will earn the reputation in the field that you are a fair counsel. Because I told the client that what I will tell the judge, how will I get you relief? I have nothing to argue, contrary to what has been done in your case. So that is one thing. The second, now to a contrary example I am citing. One matter came to me which comprised of large number of school lecturers. They were transferred from one place to another in the whole state of Punjab. I refused the brief blankly. I said, transfer, no ground. Transfers are transfer, general transfers are going on. I will not accept the brief. They went to many lawyers in the city and again came back to me. Sir, you must file the case. I said, why? I will not file. I told my clerk that I am not going to file this case because I have got nothing to tell the judges. although there was one judgment delivered by Justice D.V. Sehgal, which was in favor of my client. Now, would you believe I was forced to file that case, and the matter was listed before the bench of Justice S.P. Goel and Justice S.S. Kang. When I enter the courtroom number 10, where Justice Kang used to sit, I find that Justice D.V. Sehgal was sitting with him. Justice Kang has gone on leave that day. I cited that judgment and I got the relief. No, I do not know how, because I made one thing clear to my client, that you have got nothing in your case, but still they wanted me to file the case. But at least as the right of conscience, I had made my conscience clear. But still, after this transfer was stayed, after about 7-8 years, the matter was listed before Justice Bedi, and all the writ petitions were rendered infructuous because they have enjoyed stay for such a long time. What I'm trying to say is that you may have to wait slightly longer, but even in your initial stages, if you take the right step in the right direction, it makes a difference. And as Justice Krishna Iyer saying, that the shortcuts are always wrong cuts. Don't follow them. Always use the right path. And I think I am very lucky teaching in the law department, learning. And I also believe in another thing. Resolute determination by any professional in any profession, for that matter, in law, it makes a difference. If you are determined to excel, if you are determined to adopt ethical practices, nothing can stop you from excelling. The other thing which I always emphasize, your speech, your poses, your elocution, they are very, very important. You can practice them. I always quote the example of Disraeli. You know, Disraeli was great Prime Minister of England has ever produced and a great speaker. When he joined the Tory party at the age of 25, he was addressing a meeting as a youngster and he uttered 3 words. Only he could not go beyond 3 words. He said, I conceive, I conceive, I conceive. A lady member got up and said, Mr. Disraeli conceived 3 times, produced nothing. And Disraeli was so ashamed. Those days, when no electronic gadgets were available, he would go back to his house, practice the art of speech, thinking that he was addressing the parliament. And he became the great parliamentarian, and he came true to the word which he uttered to that lady one day will come when I will speak, everybody else will listen. So master the art of speech, elocution. Now you have so many gadgets available, tape recorder. I must confess honestly, when I started teaching, I would tape record my lecture. I will display it to myself and will find so many faults. In fact, in the beginning, I started wondering that is it me who is talking? It was so strange. Then I improved one after the other. So therefore, now you have video, you have electronic tape recorder, everything is available. Look at Disraeli. He practiced. So you go to the Supreme Court in the spare time. Don't sit in the bar room, gossip. Sit in the court number 1, court number 2. Make notes of the cases being argued. I assure you, you would learn 10, 15 judgments of the Supreme Court which you cannot read in a day sitting in your office. So kindly follow these practices. As I said, if you are resolutely determined you will start finding your ways and means of excelling also. That automatically comes. Friends, enough sermonization. I don't want to sound as a person, as a priest who is sermonizing, but I shared few of my experiences which have kept me in good stead. I have once again expressed my gratitude to the organizer for providing me this opportunity to share my views. And I am also grateful to particularly to Mr. Amar Vivek for inviting me to this webinar. Especially, I'm grateful to Professor Virender Kumar, who has always been a guiding force. I remember when I was Chief Justice Jammu and Kashmir High Court, I requested Dr. Kumar to become Director of Judicial Academy, Jammu and Kashmir High Court. But he accepted that he would be part-time coming, and he did not accept even a penny in consideration of his services. Although the High Court was very keen, the committee recommended, but he refused to take anything. I am indebted to him. Always he has given me leads in my endeavor to achieve excellence. I am humbled. I am grateful for all the to the organizer for providing me the opportunity. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, sir. Indeed, a great for us to listen to you. Thank you very much. I will fail in my duty if I don't thank personally two very special friends. Dr. Pragya Kumar, she has been a support. And I am seeing the presence of Dr. Pinky Kumar all the time with us. Thank you very much, both the august ladies and the resource persons and wonderful audience. Thank you very much, sir. Thank you.